tried to break it out because the general fund to take care of its deficit, you'd need like 0.5 of its allocated mills instead of the 1.235 that is available to it. So I kind of broke it out to say, if we had the two separate, right now, our general fund would be at 0.58175, that's what it is today. What would we need to take care of the police in whole and the township in whole? And it comes out to a little over, like a little less than 1 mil, is what we would need in the future to correct both situations.
Where are you at with this?
On the bottom of page 9, so it's about 0.9325 mils. The police department needs 0.625, and we need the 0.5, so right now we're at 5.8175, we probably need more like a 6.75 to maintain and take care of these projections.
For how long?
I'm comfortable with probably 5 years. Like I said, I'm only estimating based on my projection. They've told me in the past I'm ultra conservative. I'm just doing it based on projections.
And that's,
So,
and that's contract is 4-year contract?
4 year, yeah.
4 year.
Okay.
And that's a 0.5175 of the allocated, not of the voted, right?
No, that would be the
I guess
whole.
I'm jumping ahead,
You
talking
are.
about solutions, but yeah.
Okay, so does everyone kind of get based on that? Basically, we have a need. We need to figure out how to take care of the need. We have to figure out what priorities there are, obviously, and how we want to solve this problem. So what I did on the first page is, and I'll come back to the admin fee and why that was the way it was. So based on the information, and like I said, I know it's a lot of information to take in. I'm available to answer any questions once we put it out there. So number one, right? So our number one option is do nothing, right? So we don't do anything. Right now, our fund balance is sitting at, we budgeted at about $2.4 million, which is our, what we call our rainy day fund balance. So at the end of this year, we're estimated at 2.25 at the end of 22-23, leaving it at about a 28% fund balance. Industry standards want our fund balance to be at 15 to 25% of next year's expenditures. So as you can see, if we do that for 3 consecutive years, if we go into a deficit situation, we already have one deficit situation from last year of 99,000. You do 3 in a row, the state's gonna start looking at you, and they're gonna start your financial scores for bonding. We're gonna be rated lower. That's when they start looking after about 3 years of deficit situations.
Any amount of deficit?
Any amount of deficit within the
$10.
They don't care. You go do 3 in a row, it's gonna start affecting your
know that.
your scores.
$10 if you drown.
Yeah, we'll round up.
What I meant,
Yeah.
is there a threshold, a
Right.
ceiling or a floor? That's all.
Right.
No.
And I guess we talk about, I try to, me, and for the last years, have tried to protect the fund balance. Why? Because we used it. When it went bad, we were there. We didn't raise taxes. So it was there for exactly what it was needed for that rainy day fund, to take care of stuff that needs to get done. So, did you?
Well, I was just thinking, if we can't, how do we, if we wanted to spend our rainy day fund, but we can't exceed, if we can't deficit spend, how would we ever spend it? Or am I missing,
No, you can deficit spend, obviously, we can, but they don't want 3 years in a row, so what if you do 2 and then you skip 1? And we've been
Okay.
there in the past, when it was those bad times, we were going into fund balance. So 3 in a row is when they start looking, you know, if you can project that it's getting better, we know it's getting better. We had 3 in the last, in my history. There were 3 prior before this, there were 3 deficits. And because again, we were in that downfall, that down thing, and we were using our fund balance to keep our operations. So, it has happened, it's not practice you wanna do. So that's the one option, is do nothing and just eat up our savings. The second option is, the use of COVID money. So we've all talked about this COVID balance and what's out there. Currently now, the COVID balance is about at $951,000. So if you used the COVID money, the $951,000, after about 2 years, our COVID money would be gone. So I think the COVID monies are preferred to be used for things that, capital projects that have been put off because they're, again, we were running very slim. We didn't have enough money for roofs or to maintain capital assets. So that was like a windfall. We got this money now and we still haven't, like, the board, as a board, we still haven't put what projects that we're gonna use this money, but because of now, we're in a situation, do we use it for operations and deplete it and then push off all these capital projects down the road again? Or do we fix stuff that needs to be done? So that's
May I
a
ask
decision to
something
be
on that?
made. Yeah.
I apologize.
No, that's okay.
And I'm not pointing a finger, I just wanna know, cause I obviously wasn't a part of this, or talked about it, but when you say preferred to be used for capital projects, so, again, I know, and this is not, I know Jim's not here, but I'd like to ask him, so,
They changed, they
who was the
They
preferred by who?
I think the state
Who
was,
preferred?
the
Who
intent
preferred?
of
You
the
got, I
state
mean,
was.
the people that are here?
Not necessarily, the state was originally intended for capital projects.
Originally,
It was
That's what
intended for
was.
operation,
It was
No,
intended
no,
for
no.
COVID.
Yes, it
it
was.
was,
To
The
cover
legislature
the
changed it.
deficit spending we were doing to keep up with
Yeah.
increased medical and law enforcement operations in
Yeah, I got that from the
2020.
legislature.
due to COVID.
You're
Right.
right, no, I'm saying,
Right.
I'm saying that the original COVID money
And we did
was
spend
due
some on it.
to
We did.
police and
spend
fire,
some on that.
and the
We did.
legislature did change it, cause I got that from somebody from the legislature.
Yeah,
Right.
the federal guidelines have changed, so you can basically use it
Right.
to wherever.
You can.
Now they've
But
changed it,
That's cause they
so
want
you
their
can't
fingers to
spend
know
it on
the different issues.
pretty much any lawful
Right.
expenditure you could use it on.
Right.
It doesn't have to be just directly related to COVID, it doesn't have to be on first responders, police, fire.
It-
Well, I understand, I'm just
Right.
asking, when I read this the first time, and again, I'm not, Dave, I'm not pointing a
Yeah.
finger, I just wanted to ask Jim, I get it, Jim's not here, and it's a
Yeah,
good
but it's,
reason.
but it's kind of like,
But is
You
it
don't wanna
preferred by some of you here,
Whose preference?
more on
I guess,
operations, or rather?
For me, after sitting here 27 years, I guess I would say, if I had a chance to spend it, you need to fix it long-term. You're not gonna fix it with a COVID fix.
But we're not gonna fix it with taxes either, we can't tax our way out of every problem.
But to-
And no, there's nothing on here where there's an option where we restructure anything or solve any of these problems.
But to be clear,
Right,
I think Joe asked a very good question. So I read this as being that the strings attached to the COVID money was the preference for capital projects. But now what you're saying is that's really an internal preference to,
consider, I
that we-
guess.
well,
This
and
was my
again, not to
opinion,
say
and I'm
that we
sorry
would,
that it came
but
out
we
like that.
could use the money for operations
Yes,
as well
absolutely.
as we could use it for at this point,
Right,
it's available for both uses, but it's now an internal finance department or administration preference
What-
to focus on.
It's a finite number
Capital.
of non-replenishable.
Oh, and I fully,
So it's-
I was
it's
not pointing a
one-time
finger,
money.
I just didn't know if this meant preferred, and again, I'm not, but did you guys sit where I just
No,
wasn't
no,
this was,
around
no,
and
I'm
said?
gonna say
we
this was probably my
preferred-
opinion sitting here, and
Okay.
I'll take the
And that
blame
wasn't
for
to
it.
you, Andy.
No, that's fine,
That wasn't, I just needed to
Just
know.
keep pushing stuff off.
And I'll shed some light, a little bit of light on that. A lot of the communities, downriver communities and statewide communities, they've been utilizing the COVID dollars to satisfy capital improvements, buying equipment, not fixing necessarily structural deficits like kind of what we have here. That's not to say that you can't use it, especially if fixing that structural deficit potentially gets you to a better point where you can then fix it where it's not as much of an impact to the residents. But I think what Ann is saying is, you know, a lot of her counterparts, they've been using it for capital improvements, which we have a fair amount of that need. I mean,
Yeah.
Ann and I sat down with the police and the fire department probably a month and a half, 2 months ago. And they got a laundry list, they could spend $1 million between those two departments in a heartbeat.
But I
between-
think it was just important to know,
Yeah,
where that preference came from. Because that will guide how we look at the availability of that money. You know, if the preference is federal or state, that's one thing. If it's internal administrative or internal political, then it's good to know what that, where that preference is coming from.
That's all, I was just asking.
Yeah, but
And
no,
it-
no,
That wasn't
it's a
causing us, didn't mean to cause a stir.
Yeah.
Question.
The question was just basic. Because I know from the legislature, you know this was written twice.
Right.
This law was written
Intended.
twice.
yeah, it's changed.
This law was written twice, and I got it right from the people.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of people just sat on the money, because there was a lot of indecision and moving around of what the
Okay.
guidelines were.
And that's why the township board then makes the decision.
Right.
I guess that's my point. The township board will make the decision of what the preference is.
Right.
Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Then that's all I need to know.
Um,
just quickly on that too, because this I think was important, so I know, I think you told me, Anna, it was 99,000 was spent on the
Yeah,
fire
we
department.
used, just so everyone knows, the only expenditures that have been spent since we got this in 21, 22 was, we used approximately $69,000 for a COVID premium paid to the volunteer firemen. And we also used an additional $30,000 to reimburse the police department for their overtime caused by absences due to COVID. So those two, we did do that.
So 33 police, 66, 69
Yeah.
fire.
100,000.
Or
Yes.
something like that, close, I'm close.
But, yeah.
Is that correct?
And-
Yes, and we did need a new V8, new for this building.
Oh, HVAC.
HVAC system, which was $14,000, and we took it out of there, because we had nowhere else to take it, like, it's gonna be fund balance or whatever, so.
I would like to ask, I told Anna this, but
Emergency capital.
Derek, if we can get those before the township board, before we spend that money, that's really important to me, you know?
Yeah, and those were reviewed with the admin, with, it got run off the chain, so. you
Okay,
know,
but did we vote on the $14,000 coming?
No, it was an emergency expenditure, because it was, they had no heat and had no air conditioning for that unit, so it was discussed with the supervisor and the treasurer, and
Sure.
per our policies, we're allowed to do emergency expenditures if we, discuss that with them.
Of course, I'm just telling you as a trustee, I'm willing to have an emergency meeting, if you guys wanna have heat, I'll come to an emergency meeting for that one, cause that, for me, a big part of this is building trust. I know with the COVID money, people have been asking about it, like, where is it? And for the most part, it's still there, but I think we need to build trust with that and have an open process, let people know how we're spending it, and that's important to me, so I just wanted to put that out there,
Well, it's just as important why we might be sitting on it, right? Not just why we're spending it or how we're spending it, but what is our rationale for not spending it? Like you said earlier, early on, people were worried that if they spent it and the rules changed, they would have to pay it back. So a
For the
lot of
first year was very
communities sat
strict,
on it.
they made it pretty strict.
Yes.
I'm still not convinced that I can take $100,000 and say my deficit is I'm 500 and I'm gonna take 500 and use it. I'm still not convinced of that.
I think we're in pretty good shape. I'm not the finance director.
Well,
but,
I need to
I
see it
understand
like-
Ann's
I-
trepidation, because the guidelines are
Yeah.
that thick, right? But, everybody's been using it for pretty much what they wanna use it for, and the federal government's kinda said, hey, anything eligible, any governmental expenditure is an eligible expenditure. And Dave and I were at an MTA conference a couple of months ago, and that's exactly what MTA even said, so.
That's why they lobbied to get it changed, so they could get their fingers in it to do capital improvements. Because, and again, I'm not, it's police and fire, but COVID, what do you think of when you think of COVID, police and fire?
Right.
And that's why it was changed. I don't care if it's changed or not, I'm just saying, I just needed to know where that came from.
Also to the
Yeah,
clerk,
no, it was,
also to the clerk's point, the money is sat there because we haven't had a conversation
right.
with the board about what you wanna do with it.
Right.
So trying to keep options available means leaving it in the bank until we have that conversation, and it's part of the conversation tonight, right? It's an option because it wasn't allocated, and it's been sitting there waiting for this conversation, so.
And I'd like to have you address, Jameson made the point about restructuring some of this. My recollection is that when we look at the sewage treatment plant, we've gone to an operator because it's cheaper than having somebody from the township, and we took it over from the county almost 40 years ago. We used to have 5 people at the airport that worked there. The Eastons would have their family reunion every morning around the coffee cooler, and we now have Frank and Jean there. I look at what's going on in the offices downstairs. We've had people that have retired, and we've melded positions together. Brian Friel's doing the job of several people. Police is retained pretty much the same staff level, give or take 1 or 2, but fire were at 50 several decades ago. 40 years ago, you had 50 firefighters. Now you're down to 18. I look at the number of people that are working in the DPS. I look at the number of people that are at the airport. And when we look at the options that you've given us 6 options. And services have been promised and maintained at a certain level, but we're reducing force and also reducing costs with that. We have more money now that is required to be paid so that we get down to that 15-year amortization. We went from 28, 29, now we're looking at coming down to 15. That's an additional cost every year. It's an incremental cost. We've looked at how you can retire the MERS deficit. 35 years ago, when Sally Grosdick was the clerk, you had a surplus. You were getting more money back from MERS so that you did not have a deficit because of the return on investment. When interest rates were around 18, 19, 20%, your return on your investment outpaced your cost for retirement and the cost of the other factors that you have. Healthcare. Healthcare goes up inflation plus typically 3-4% a year, maybe 5%. We're looking at what it costs to do roads right now. We're looking at all of the costs for the retirement. It's not going down. And I appreciate the idea that we can't tax our way out of something, but you can't add, and I'm not passing any kind of crepe on this, but if you go to 24 in the police department, you're now paying for more than you were last year, 2 years ago. That's something that we all voted on, we all supported. But Headley and its progeny have made it difficult for your tax revenues stemming from property taxes in particular. They have throttled that so that when inflation is above 3%, 4%, the real cost is going up faster than your property taxes. And when you've cut down the number of people that you have here, and again, I'm looking at Brian Friel doing the job of a couple people, just as one individual, and we have others within community development, and certainly within your office. You know, we've had positions combined. I don't know, when I look at those 6 options, that there's anything other than what is the least worst scenario. And when I look at those options, doing nothing strikes me as not an answer.
Sure.
Going into the rainy day fund, because again, if you have something that requires a replacement in money right now, plus it's gonna hurt your credits, now you're gonna be spending more. The return on the investment that we've been getting, David has been telling us that it's several $100s every month, maybe $1,000 in a good month. I haven't seen too much of that. We used to get $70,000 and $80,000 on the return on investment. So when we look at those things, my point is that restructuring, while I like the concept, I'm not sure that there's much that can be done in terms of restructuring. I think that's why Derek and the people that negotiated the contract for the police department did a pretty good job with 3%. Inflation's going to be higher than 3%. And we've seen this last year where your CPI is probably closer to 8% and beyond. Seniors are getting an 8% raise in their Social Security. We look at those factors and you have a couple of things going. You're throttled, your taxes are throttled effectively by the Headley and its progeny. The state is requiring you to contribute higher numbers every year,
Right.
ratcheting down to that. And then you look at the cost of insurances and the other things that seem to go up beyond the 3% that we have. I don't know that there's going to be any easy answers. My preference is looking at this, looking at what we've done, having the voters, the public understand that we have been cutting consistently for the last, I'm going to say last decade and a half, Ann. And when I say cutting, I mean cutting positions. And at some point, CEO of Ford Motor Company looked at it and said, you can only cut so much before you get to the bone and have to start making a profit. Question is, are we at that point where we have cut to the bone and now we have to look at taxes? And that's the part that bothers me. Out of those 6, there's no good options. Although Kyle had an idea a few years ago about buying lottery tickets, so.
Yeah, I think you raised some good points, but looking at those projections, effectively, the cost of operation is going to continue to increase exponentially, right? So every year retirement's gonna cost more, and it's gonna cost more than it did the year before. Maybe one year it ticks down a little bit, but then the next year it'll jump up, and the cost of healthcare is gonna continue to increase. So we need to find solutions to this, and I don't know what those solutions are, right? I'm not a expert on municipal funding or anything, but we gotta find solutions to this that aren't just, well, let's ask the voters for more money, right? Because there's gonna be a point, they're very generous people here in Grosse Ile, but there's gonna be a point where they're gonna say, no more money, township, figure it out.
And you're gonna be cutting
You know.
services at that point.
So I think sometimes we need to find efficiency, or we need to find ways to do more with less, or we need to, I don't know, we gotta do a deep dive on this and figure out ways to pull this off that I don't think we're gonna figure out in an hour sitting here today.
No. One of the things that's important is, and Ann is big on history, and yeah, Ann, you are tagged as being very conservative with this. And God bless you, I would rather see somebody conservative than somebody trying to crunch numbers on assumptions that don't make any sense. But if you look at the history of the millages, you will find that when it comes to funding fire and police, and I'm a big supporter of the fire and the police. I voted for every millage that's been out there for fire and police. The one thing that I note is, and Ann said it tonight, 5-year projection. In everything we've done, when Bob was here working on the police 5-year plans, every time we did that, we found that at the 5-year mark, you were underwater. When we used a 3/4 mil to breach the gap, that was with the expectation that we could do this for 4 or 5 years. The problem is, it's not just a permanent fix. It's a temporary fix because Headley is throttling the development of the taxes, and I get that, and that's what the voters supported. I don't have a problem with that. The reality is, at some point, you have to start looking at what services do we have? What services make sense?
Well, and a good emphasis of that is, my understanding is the general fund villages, the allocated and the voted, those were the start of the police department. Then every time that you got underwater, each one of these smaller villages is the add-on top of that, and on top of that, because as costs kept going up, those were the solutions. So this is the long history of this exact conversation, I'm sure happened 10 years ago, and 10 years prior to that, 10 years prior to that.
And that's why they come in different amounts.
Yep.
3/4 was 0.75 of a mil, that would get us over that hump. But when you look at that, the undercurrent is all of the costs that keep coming up, and the Headley and its children, if we can, have tamped down the ability to keep up with that. I look at that, and that is the true problem here. That is the big problem, and we can do a super millage. We can ask the voters to approve a 1/2 mil or a 3/4 mil or a mil. 5 years from now, there's gonna be 7 people sitting up there. Same thing, what do we do? How do we cut the costs? How do we make that work? It's not a pretty picture.
If you look at the projections of MERS, they do go down. But not time I'm gonna say, it's gonna be another 10, 15 years. 10, 15 years, I mean, you can see it's gonna go up and then it's gonna come up, because there have been changes. There are changes, like they said today, they're expensive right now, but if you're looking for that long haul, so the township can continue to survive, they do go down. It has been changed so that costs become, but it's not any, just because we change it today, it ain't changing probably for.
And some of it, Jameson, you're gonna be looking at 20, 30 years out. The city of Livonia, 25 years ago, went from a defined benefit plan, or defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. And effectively shifting the risk to the employees that they're gonna do better with a defined contribution than they will with the defined benefit plan.
I would
So-
be curious to see how those municipalities are faring with their.
Some of them are doing well, some of them are not.
Back,
Some have reverted back to.
reverted back.
They've gone back to having a defined benefit plan. Livonia will tell you it was a great thing.
And the problem with that kind of a change,
I realize you pay for two plans simultaneously for a
and
while.
so you have to pay what you owe in the pension plan. Plus, you know, whether it's 3, 4, 5, 6% into some kind of a defined contribution plan. Short term, it's gonna be measurably more expensive, short term, to make that switch.
And keep in mind that, you know, this is a big issue with the police and the general fund. Some of our other accounts are doing just fine, right? Airports and enterprise fund, it doesn't rely on tax dollars. Recreation has dedicated villages and they're faring just fine. So, you know, we have done some consolidation and some reorganization as it relates especially to those departments that rely on general fund dollars. We've got a combination community development DDA director now. So even though the DDA portion comes out of DDA funds, that community development director's position, half their salary is paid by that. Township manager used to be fully paid through the general fund. When we combine DDA, or DPS director and township manager into one position, half the salary is paid by the DPW department, DPS department. So that reduced that salary that hit the general fund by almost half. Friel is another one that you had mentioned through our clerk's office. Combine that with some communications
And
responsibilities.
I apologize for not mentioning you specifically because you were an example.
No problem, no, I don't, as far as ordinance enforcement, we combine the animal control officer position with ordinance enforcement, so that's a dual role position. So, over the past probably 18 months, we've taken quite a few strides to move to consolidate things, but we still have, obviously, a deficit here, and a deficit that would have been much worse if we hadn't made those efforts to get to that point, so. You know, and I get your point exactly, though. I mean, I got my tax bill today. I mean, it's up
Yeah.
almost $450. I voted for the roads millage, so I'm fine with that, but we have to be concerned about how it impacts what you get in the mail here. Cause eventually the residents are not gonna wanna be here.
So let's kind of go into option 3. We talked about the admin fee.
What's
And I
the-
know,
Just quickly, what's the next, union contract negotiation? I know PIM's 4 years, but is there another?
So we have a,
next
keep in mind, we have
This year.
a TPOAM contract that comes up in, I believe, March. So
March,
we'll
okay.
start with negotiations this winter
Okay.
regarding that contract.
let's go back to 3, and you can see why 3 was so important. 3, the admin fee was basically, and the reason why it came so quickly is because we needed to get it on the tax bills that were going out that Friday. So that was the rush to put it in front of you, say, this is an option, but the timing was terrible, because the bills had to go out, it either had to be there or not had to be there, so there was no intent, it was just a way to fix it, and it was a temporary fix. If you look at 2023, that's when our big problem is. We were just trying to get something out there, get it in the meantime, till we had time, because if you look at our 23 to 24, now we do have leeway. We do have some taxing ability, and that's what the admin fee came in. Yes, it looked terrible, timing was awful, I get all that, but the financial behind it was, we had to get it on the tax bill if it was going to happen to correct the situation for this fiscal year, and it was gonna alleviate for a while, for a year or two, till the millage rates went down, and it would be a more proper time to look at the police department in a whole. That's all that was doing, and if you look at these charts, it's very obvious that that's what was trying to happen as a temporary fix that we had, that the board could do. It could be assessed, it didn't have to be assessed, but that was why it was brought to you the way it was with the urgency. And it was turned down, so that's not our issue, so we can, that's why.
It's still on the table.
Just still on the table, but not at that
We don't
time.
have to decide.
So if that helps to understand where that came from and why that came in the way it did.
But if you look at it pragmatically, you know, if you compare option number 2 with option number 3, right? One is to tap into the COVID money, which is the rainy day
Right.
fund for the rainy day fund, or to tax the citizens that 1%, add that
Right.
1% to their taxes. So it's a it ends up being a philosophical debate, and obviously the COVID money was our tax money too, right?
Right,
We
yeah.
all paid
It
into
will-
that.
It's
So,
pay now or pay later, like I said,
Exactly,
when your roof
it's-
falls off and you need a new roof, where are you gonna get the $400,000 to pay for it? So it's that whole pay now or pay later, keep pushing it off, eventually, money's gonna be, the police department need a generator, $400,000, the generator breaks, where are you gonna go? You're gonna go to rainy day, you're gonna go, so these are all, they all come together, it's not one, we're not just taking care of the police department, we gotta look at the whole picture of what's around us, and sometimes we get lost with that.
The good news is, as Derek has said, if you look at all of our funds out there, you can look out here at the airport. Some people think that storage unit is the ugliest thing that's ever hit North America. The reality is, it comes with about $94,000 a year. That helps the airport, plus the 50 other tenants that Janelle has and all of the airport pilots that are there. You look at Water's Edge. Kim came in with a $7,000 fund balance, and it's been as high as $200,000. Fire is healthy, DPS is healthy, sewer is healthy, airport is healthy, not only because of that, but with everything else. The one area where we are short happens to be, as you said, the tension between police and general budget. That's, everything else we can talk about how ugly this is. But 5 out of 6 is pretty good. Ted Williams didn't even do that.
No, I agree that 5 out of 6 is pretty good.
But the problem is, how do we make that leap? We've looked at trying to do something with retirement. There's an argument to be said, the nice thing about inflation is you get a higher return on your investment, which is gonna drive down the cost of your pension. But then you make that up with higher labor costs, and higher insurances, and higher everything else.
Well, there's other things too, right? There's strategic and tactical responses that could save manpower and money, right? But,
I'm open.
you know, that'd be probably a discussion for the chief, I'm sure he's probably already got ideas, but I think we just asked the voters for a bunch of money last month, and they gave it to the township, they said, here you go, yep, roads, yep, schools, yep, sewer systems, we love all that stuff, police, fire. I think that to go ahead and just slap them with a 1% fee right now would just be a little bit disingenuous. And if
You're never gonna get my support for that. I am not gonna
either.
support that 1%.
But
I know.
if we wanna float a millage and see if, that's how you ask the voters, right? So voters, do you want 24 police officers? Then it's gonna cost you $78 a year.
That's
or whatever.
that's again, that's the basis of a general law township,
Right.
is again that we don't have to have a police department, right? We don't have to have a fire department, because we're general law township. We can contract those services out to our counties. Many townships do. I'm not saying that's the solution. Our people have said, year after year, for decades, we want a dedicated Grosse Ile Police Department and a dedicated Grosse Ile Fire Department. So we have, as voters and taxpayers, said that we want to charge ourselves for these premium services, because also they save on our insurance bill, right? Because we have such a good public safety department, our homeowners insurance, our mortgage, all those insurances are less. The problem is when a township, a general law township, that uses a state allocation to run itself, which it has to do. I mean, we have to fulfill the roles of the supervisor, treasurer, and clerk. Not necessarily the individuals, but the roles have to be done, the assessing has to be done. There are essential services that a township has to pay out of those two mills, right? And we, at some point, paid for a police department out of that. We decided that we're not gonna tax the residents extra, we're going to pay a police department out of our state allocated millage.
So maybe.
Then, I just wanna go on one more thing.
No, sorry.
So when I first started as clerk, there was, this discussion started, because that's when we started with the extra voted millages for the police department. At that point, though, we were making a lot of money, like 800, 900,000 a year in state shared revenue, which came to us through the gas tax and so forth. So, you know, but this tension, I think Derek used the perfect word, this tension between the police department and the administration is generated by the fact that we have to have an administration and we want to have a police department, but we only get a small pot of money from the state to pay for both. And so ultimately, the decision will have to go back to the voters to say, this is what our premium police department costs us. Are you willing to continue to fund your desire to have that, right? So it's not, but it's not willy-nilly raising a tax or a fee. It's again putting the decision in the hands of the voters. But I think what administration was looking for was a stopgap until we could get something on a ballot, right?
Well,
And,
and also get it on the ballot at a time that it doesn't blow your tax bills out of the water. Because number one, I think,
Well, 2023, the tax bills are out of the water.
well, I mean, imagine adding on another mill on top of that.
That's what
Not only, number one, is that gonna cause a problem for being able to get it passed,
But the
Well, number
corollary to
two-
that is you're also losing, or having dropped off, the sewage millage that's there. The judgment, and you've got the Water's Edge mortgage that's gonna be ending. You have a number of things that are coming off in '24, which is you're getting there. It is a short-term problem in terms of looking at that, but it is a long-term problem because every 5 years you're gonna be sitting up here and coming to the same thing.
So if a stopgap measure is how the voters can make a decision is what we need, then I think the COVID money makes a lot of sense.
Well, that's, you know what, oh, I'm sorry,
I mean, that was my two. I have a quick question for, the clerk. So when the voters make a decision on a police millage, right? They're voting how much money they're gonna spend on police. They're not voting for a specific structure or a specific, you know, it's just, we're gonna spend $100 million on police. They're not saying, we're gonna spend $100 million on police and they have to have 47 cars, right?
no, but
There's
there
no
are,
caveats.
well, there are in a sense, one is for operations, well, I know, with fire,
Yeah,
it's
not the
like.
police, just
Right.
fire.
So
So
fire's just, hey, we're paying for a police department, we're willing to pay this much money, you figure out how to spend
you
it.
figure out how to run the department
Okay.
on this
See,
much
there's a
money.
couple of things.
This
that
is your budget.
we gotta be cognizant of. Many years ago, when we were dealing with this, when I even just came on, it's true, I don't know if Derek brought, I'm sorry, or Ann brought it up, that before, we were in just general fund. Those little pieces came on, and they were towards the police only, they weren't the opposite. They weren't that the general fund or the admin offices here were having troubles, the police department every year, and that's what happens. The cost goes up, and over, I don't know, maybe it's been 40 years or so that they've had these, you know, certain increases. So the question is, does the state shared revenue take care of our administrative part here, the township, and, you know, the offices and whatever? And the answer is yes, it's been.
not,
So,
not
If you look at
Not
the future,
anymore.
it won't.
Well-
We're running short now.
Yeah.
no, up to now, what I'm saying is, it has been. It
Yes.
has been.
Yes, we've been
The
good.
million, whatever
Yeah.
we get, 1 million now, 50,000, can handle the budget for the, I call it administration
Right.
office, whatever you guys,
Right.
I don't know however you call
Yeah.
it, but that, you understand what I'm saying.
Okay.
So the next step is, what you guys are talking about, and I agree with you in saying that if we have a fund, and so we have a rainy day fund, and we have a COVID fund, I would really be hard pressed not to use some of the COVID for police and fire. I get it, there's a turn there, I think the people will have a problem if they find out that 950,000 of COVID money went to fixing the roof. Or when, I mean, there's just a stigma to it with me, maybe because I was the police chief. I don't know, I'm sorry, I apologize if I have, if I'm thinking that way.
You would rather use it toward the police
Just a
than the
little,
roof.
yeah, no, not a lot. I'm just saying you can still fix and use it as a Band-Aid for now, I'm
Yeah.
not saying,
Yeah,
you know, we need 150, do we need 200,000, do we need, you know, whatever, Doug, and we get together and figure out what we need, and then let the people decide, because the people have the ability to either say, look, we want a police department like this, or we want like this, and if they don't, look, this is just life. If they don't want one like this, Doug, then we're gonna have to do some thinking and some talking at the police commission level, and what your recommendations and what, you know, we come up with together
Yeah.
and work on it, and try to solve that problem. But, you know, the rainy day fund is there, and we did use that. You're right, there was many years when I was the police chief, we had to use it for the township. And I just think that a small amount from the COVID would show, I mean, it's, I don't wanna use the word in good faith, that's not the right term. For lack of a better term, I'll just say that.
Prudent, it's prudent.
Prudent, how about prudent, that some of that be used to get us through this problem with the police department right now. Now, with the fire millage, I'm assuming, because we went through this, that the fire, it will be solved, you know, it'll be okay. The fire department will be, how about we just say it's okay? And it is, because they did, I think it was .75, correct? Wasn't anything else, so, okay, so that's what they get for the bill, they get 3/4 of a mil coming in, and they'll be okay. So I'm in favor, I guess Jameson was too, I don't want to speak for him, but it sounded like Anuta, that I'm in favor of